Why are we here? The Buddha's profound answer. What if death is not the end, but merely a doorway? What if, instead of fading into oblivion, your consciousness continues, drifting through an unknown realm, shaped by the choices you made in this life? For centuries, Buddhism has taught that death is not a final destination but a transition, a passage into the mysterious state known as the bardo. But here's something even more astonishing: this transition is not random. It is determined by your karma, your state of mind at the moment of passing, and the deeply ingrained habits of your consciousness. Modern science, too, is beginning to uncover puzzling evidence that challenges the materialist view of death. Thousands of verified past life memories, near-death experiences, and accounts from Tibetan monks who claim to recall their previous incarnations all point to one profound truth: the cycle of rebirth is real. But if this cycle is real, then the next question is even more urgent: can we influence where we go next? The answer is yes. In today's video, we will unravel the secrets of what happens between death and rebirth, explore the teachings of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and uncover how meditation, karma, and awareness can shape your next existence, or even help you escape the cycle altogether. But to truly grasp these mysteries, you must stay until the end, because what you learn today may forever change how you see life, death, and the choices you make in every moment. Let's begin. The Buddhist view of life and death, a profound perspective. Buddhism unveils a vision of existence that transcends the limitations of a single lifetime. Life and death are not endpoints but intertwined phases in an infinite cycle, samsara. Unlike the linear perception of life seen in many Western traditions, where birth is the beginning and death is the final curtain, Buddhism sees existence as a flowing river, constantly shifting, never stagnant. This cyclical nature of life is governed by karma, the law of cause and effect. Every thought, word, and action we produce shapes the contours of our future existence, just as our present reality is sculpted by past choices, whether in this life or those before it. The mind, untethered from the physical body at death, carries the imprints of past experiences, seamlessly moving toward its next manifestation. This understanding is not merely philosophical speculation, it has been supported by compelling accounts throughout history. Take the case of Tibetan tulkus, reincarnated masters recognized from childhood, who recall intricate details of their previous lives with astonishing accuracy. The most famous example is the Dalai Lama himself. When he was a young child, he was presented with objects belonging to the previous Dalai Lama and correctly identified them without hesitation. Such phenomena challenge the purely materialistic view that consciousness is merely a byproduct of the brain. Moreover, samsara provides an answer to one of the greatest moral quandaries in theology. If a just and omnipotent creator exists, why is there such disparity in human fate? Why is one child born into privilege and another into suffering? The Buddhist explanation is both empowering and illuminating. Our circumstances are not arbitrary, nor dictated by divine favoritism, but instead the natural consequence of previous actions. Even modern scientific research has started to acknowledge aspects of this ancient wisdom. Studies conducted by psychiatrist Dr. Ian Stevenson documented thousands of cases of young children who recalled past lives with verifiable details. Many of these children provided names, locations, and events that were later confirmed to be historically accurate, despite never having been exposed to such information in their current lifetime. Thus, Buddhism does not offer a fearful finality in death but a dynamic, ever-evolving journey. To truly grasp this perspective is to free oneself from the paralyzing fear of mortality. Life is neither a one-time chance nor a fleeting moment doomed to oblivion. Instead, it is an intricate, ongoing story, one that we are constantly writing with every choice we make. How consciousness moves from one body to another, the journey beyond death. Rebirth is not a simple continuation, nor is it random. It follows a deeply intricate and precise pattern governed by the force of karma. To grasp this, we must abandon the idea that consciousness is confined to the brain, much like how music is not trapped within a radio. The body is merely a vessel, a temporary receiver of an eternal, shifting stream of awareness. A more profound analogy is that of a candle flame. Imagine lighting one candle from another. The second flame is not identical to the first, yet it is not entirely separate either. In the same way, when one life ends, its karmic energy ignites the next. Preserving continuity while allowing transformation, at the moment of death, the dissolution of the physical body is only part of the process. What continues is the stream of consciousness, which carries imprints of all past actions, thoughts, and tendencies. This is known as bhavāga in Buddhist psychology, the undercurrent of the mind that flows unceasingly, linking one life to the next. This transition is vividly described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Bardo Thodol, an ancient text that details the intermediate state between death and rebirth. It speaks of luminous visions, karmic winds, and a moment of great clarity where the consciousness glimpses its true nature before being drawn, like iron to a magnet, toward a new form of existence. Some highly advanced meditators, aware of this process, have even controlled their own rebirth. One striking historical case is that of Jetsun Milarepa, Tibet's great yogi. Before his death, Milarepa's disciples asked him where he would be reborn. He pointed to a pigeon resting on the monastery roof, hinting that he would take form through that creature. Some traditions recount that his consciousness later returned as an enlightened master, fulfilling a promise of guiding beings across lifetimes, but not all transitions lead to auspicious rebirths. Buddhist cosmology reveals 6 realms of existence, each dictated by the momentum of past karma: heavenly realm, a domain of immense pleasure and beauty, but temporary. Beings here risk spiritual complacency; Asura realm, a realm of power and conflict, where demigods battle endlessly for dominance, driven by pride and jealousy; human realm, the most precious realm, where wisdom can be cultivated. Here, suffering and joy intertwine, making enlightenment possible; animal realm, a state of ignorance and instinct, where beings live by fear and desire, unable to comprehend deeper truths; hungry ghost realm, a shadowy world of insatiable craving, where spirits wander, tormented by unfulfilled desires and attachments; hell realm, the most harrowing existence, born from extreme hatred and cruelty, where suffering manifests intensely as a reflection of past actions; each moment of thought, speech, and action plants a seed, determining which realm one will enter. The Buddha himself likened this process to a potter shaping clay. The impressions of our deeds mold the vessel of our future existence. Thus, life and death are not separate events but an unbroken stream. To understand this is to awaken to the truth that we are not prisoners of fate, we are sculptors of our own destiny. Can we escape the cycle of rebirth? To escape the endless cycle of samsara, one must recognize that the chains binding us are not external forces but the illusions we create within our own minds. The Buddha taught that attachment, ignorance, and craving are the 3 poisons that keep us trapped in the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Like a moth drawn to a flame, beings continuously chase after fleeting pleasures, clinging to what is impermanent, and recoiling from suffering, thus ensuring their return to this world of endless change. The path to liberation begins with wisdom, the deep realization that all things are impermanent, all phenomena are without a fixed self, and that suffering arises from mistaken perception. This wisdom is cultivated through the practice of vipassana meditation, where one observes the nature of mind and body, seeing how sensations arise and pass away, moment by moment. In this state of heightened awareness, the illusion of a permanent self dissolves, revealing the emptiness that lies at the core of all existence. One of the most powerful historical examples of transcending samsara is Bodhidharma, the legendary monk who brought Zen Buddhism to China. When asked by Emperor Wu what merit he had gained from building temples and supporting Buddhism, Bodhidharma answered, "None whatsoever." His reply shocked the emperor, but it revealed a deep truth: true liberation is not achieved through external acts alone, but through the direct realization of the mind's nature. Yet, wisdom alone is not enough. The heart must also be transformed. This is where compassion comes in. True compassion is not mere kindness but the ability to see beyond the self, to understand that all beings suffer and are caught in the same cycle of rebirth. The great Buddhist saint Shantideva once said, "All the joy the world contains comes from wishing happiness for others. All the suffering the world contains comes from wishing happiness for oneself. By cultivating boundless compassion, the grip of ego loosens, and the attachments that fuel rebirth begin to fade, but perhaps the most profound key to breaking samsara is letting go of fear, especially the fear of death. The Buddha compared life and death to the waves of an ocean, if one sees only the surface. Each wave appears separate, rising and falling in isolation. But if one looks deeper, they realize that the waves and the ocean are not two things, they are one continuous, ever-changing movement. When fear dissolves, so does the illusion of a separate self, and with it, the need to be reborn. The path is not easy, but those who walk it, practicing mindfulness, cultivating compassion, and seeking wisdom, gradually awaken to a truth beyond life and death. And in that awakening, the cycle of rebirth comes to an end, not through destruction, but through transcendence. Karma, the law that shapes our destiny. Karma is like a vast river, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always flowing according to the natural course of past actions. It is neither a cosmic reward system nor a divine punishment, but a law as impartial and unyielding as gravity. Just as a seed, once planted, will grow into a tree bearing fruit of its kind, every thought, word, and deed we perform sets in motion ripples that will eventually return to us. One of the most compelling examples of karma in history is the life of King Ashoka, the ruthless emperor who transformed into a devout Buddhist. Early in his reign, Ashoka waged brutal wars, leading to the massacre of over 100,000 people in the conquest of Kalinga. However, the unbearable suffering he witnessed planted a different seed in his mind, one of remorse and transformation. He turned away from violence, embraced Buddhist principles, and dedicated his life to spreading peace and dharma. This shift in karma did not erase his past actions, but it set him on a new path, proving that karma is not a prison, it is a choice we remake in every moment. Another striking example is found in the story of Angulimala, a feared murderer who had killed 999 people, believing that completing 1,000 murders would grant him ultimate power. However, upon encountering the Buddha, Angulimala experienced a profound awakening. He abandoned his violent ways, devoted himself to spiritual practice, and eventually attained enlightenment. The consequences of his past karma still followed him, people feared and despised him, but his inner transformation freed him from the cycle of suffering and rebirth. His story teaches us a crucial truth: while we cannot escape the consequences of past actions, we can always transform our future. Many wonder why good people sometimes suffer while the wicked seem to prosper. This paradox is explained by understanding that karma unfolds across multiple lifetimes, not just in the present moment. A person who appears to be fortunate despite their misdeeds may be reaping the rewards of good deeds from a previous life, just as a virtuous person undergoing hardship may be burning away the remnants of past negative karma. But karma is not destiny. It is fluid, ever-changing, and shaped by every choice we make. A single act of kindness, a moment of deep insight, or a decision to let go of hatred can alter the trajectory of one's karma, much like a river that changes course when it meets a new current. The Buddha himself said, "If you want to know your past life, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future life, look at your present actions." This realization is both liberating and empowering. We are not bound by an unchangeable fate. At every moment, with every thought, we are sculpting our future. Those who understand this take responsibility for their actions, cultivating wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness, knowing that the seeds they plant today will shape their destiny in ways seen and unseen. Real-life evidence of rebirth. The phenomenon of past life memories is not just a subject of spiritual speculation, it has been rigorously examined by researchers who have documented thousands of compelling cases. One of the most renowned pioneers in this field was Dr. Ian Stevenson, whose life's work involved meticulously investigating children who spontaneously recalled past lives. Unlike mere fantasies or imagination, many of these children provided specific names, locations, and events that could later be verified. One of the most astonishing cases is that of a young boy named Shanti Devi, born in India in the 1930s. At the age of 4, Shanti began speaking about a previous life in a town she had never visited. She insisted that she had been a woman named Luji, described her past life husband in detail, and even provided the names of her children. She spoke of the house she had lived in and the manner in which she had died during childbirth. Curious and skeptical, researchers traveled with Shanti to the town she described. To their shock, the details she provided matched perfectly with a woman who had died just a few years before Shanti was born. Even Luji's husband, upon meeting Shanti, was stunned by her knowledge of intimate details that no outsider could have possibly known. Similarly, in the United States, Dr. Jim B. Tucker, a successor to Dr. Stevenson at the University of Virginia, studied the case of James Leininger, a boy who from the age of 2 experienced terrifying nightmares of dying in a plane crash. James spoke in detail about being a World War II pilot, flying a Corsair fighter jet, and being shot down by enemy fire over the Pacific. He mentioned the name Natoma Bay, the aircraft carrier from which he had supposedly flown, and James Houston Jr., the name of the pilot he claimed to have been. His parents, initially dismissing his words as mere childhood imagination, were astounded when historical research confirmed that James Houston Jr. had indeed been a real pilot who died in the exact manner their son described. Even more astonishing, James later met the surviving members of his past life family and recalled personal details that convinced them he was their lost relative reborn. Beyond individual cases, cultures around the world hold deep-rooted beliefs in reincarnation. In Tibetan Buddhism, the process of identifying the reincarnation of a great Lama is highly systematic. The most famous example is that of the Dalai Lama, whose successor is traditionally chosen through a series of tests and signs that align with past life memories. When the 14th Dalai Lama was a young child, he was able to recognize objects belonging to his predecessor, providing further weight to the Buddhist belief in the continuity of consciousness. These cases and countless others raise profound questions. If the brain alone were responsible for identity and memory, how could young children recall lives they never lived? If death were the absolute end, how could precise memories re-emerge in a new body? The answer, as suggested by both Buddhist teachings and modern research, is that consciousness is not confined to a single lifetime. It flows like a river, changing form but never ceasing to exist. How to purify karma and create a better future? Karma is not a prison, nor is it an unbreakable chain of suffering. It is a fluid force, constantly shifting based on our intentions and actions. Just as a drop of ink may darken a cup of water but becomes invisible in a vast ocean, so too can negative karma be diluted and transformed by an overwhelming force of goodness. The Buddha taught that no matter how much unwholesome karma we have accumulated, we always have the power to purify it and redirect our path toward enlightenment. The first step in transforming karma is awareness. Most people live their lives on autopilot, unaware that their daily thoughts and actions are shaping their future. The Buddha urged his followers to engage in deep self-reflection. Are my actions leading me towards suffering or liberation? Am I acting out of greed, anger, or delusion? By becoming conscious of our choices, we can begin to break free from harmful patterns. However, awareness alone is not enough. We must also engage in true repentance. Repentance in Buddhism is not about self-punishment or guilt, it is about transmutation. When we recognize our past mistakes, we must acknowledge them fully, resolve to never repeat them, and cultivate opposite virtues. Just as fire can burn away impurities in gold, genuine remorse and commitment to righteousness can cleanse negative karma. Beyond repentance, positive karma must be actively cultivated. A single candle can dispel darkness, and similarly, acts of compassion, generosity, and wisdom weaken the effects of past negative karma. When we help others, not only do we lighten their burdens, but we also transform our own spiritual trajectory. Consider the practice of dana, generosity. By giving freely, we counteract lifetimes of selfishness. By cultivating metta, loving kindness, we dissolve the karmic seeds of anger and resentment. One of the most powerful tools in karma purification is meditation. The mind is the ultimate architect of our destiny, and through meditation, we gain direct insight into the impermanence of all things, including karma itself. In deep meditative absorption, advanced practitioners can even burn away negative karmic imprints before they manifest. This is why countless Buddhist monks dedicate their lives to mindfulness and self-purification. A remarkable historical example is the story of Angulimala, the feared murderer who was said to have taken hundreds of lives. He was destined for unimaginable suffering due to his heinous crimes. Yet, upon meeting the Buddha, he experienced a profound awakening. He renounced violence, took up the path of Dharma, and through years of spiritual practice, he attained enlightenment and became an arahant. His story is a testament to the fact that no matter how dark our past, our future remains unwritten, and through wisdom, repentance, and righteous action, we can transform even the heaviest karma into a path of liberation. What happens between death and rebirth? The journey between death and rebirth is one of the most mysterious aspects of existence. In Tibetan Buddhism, this transition is known as bardo, a liminal state where the consciousness is untethered, floating between worlds, shaped by past karma and mental conditioning. It is said that what happens in this state can determine whether one is reborn into suffering or transcends the cycle of samsara altogether. Bardo is not a singular moment but a passage through a fluid and dynamic process, offering both danger and opportunity. At the moment of death, the mind is stripped of its physical limitations, and the clear light of ultimate reality is revealed. For a spiritually advanced person, one who has spent years meditating on emptiness and non-attachment, this moment is the gateway to enlightenment. Upon recognizing this luminous truth, they merge with it, attaining nirvana without needing to return. However, for the untrained mind, this brilliant light is overwhelming, even terrifying. Instead of surrendering to it, most beings recoil, clinging to their familiar sense of self. This single moment determines whether a person breaks free from samsara or continues deeper into the bardo. For those who fail to recognize the clear light, consciousness drifts into a dreamlike state filled with vivid hallucinations. These visions are not random but manifestations of one's own karma, reflections of past actions, thoughts, and emotions. Some experience celestial beings, radiant Buddhas, and blissful landscapes, while others encounter terrifying demons, monstrous figures, and nightmarish landscapes of fire and darkness. Yet, these visions are illusions. The Buddhas do not come to reward, nor do the demons come to punish. They are merely expressions of the mind's deepest fears and desires, projected onto the vast screen of consciousness. If one can remain calm and recognize them as mere mirages, liberation is still possible at this stage. But if fear, attachment, or confusion take hold, the soul is pulled deeper into the forces of karma, setting the stage for rebirth. This is the most critical phase, where the pull of reincarnation becomes inescapable. The consciousness, no longer able to maintain its formless state, is driven by karmic currents toward its next life. The desires and attachments accumulated over lifetimes act as a magnetic force, drawing the being toward a particular womb, family, and circumstances. It is said that in this phase, the soul glimpses its future parents and experiences a powerful longing to enter the physical realm once more. However, this is not a conscious choice, it is a compulsion dictated by past actions. A being filled with anger and hatred may be drawn toward a turbulent existence, while one filled with compassion and wisdom may take birth in a noble or spiritually conducive environment. The key teaching of the Bardo is that death does not determine our fate, our state of mind at the moment of death does. This is why Tibetan monks spend their lives preparing for the moment of death, training themselves to remain conscious and fearless during the transition. Great masters such as Milarepa and Padmasambhava were said to have navigated the Bardo with full awareness, choosing their rebirths or even escaping the cycle entirely. The Tibetan Book of the Dead serves as a guide for those in the Bardo, recited by monks to help the departing soul recognize illusions, remain calm, and seek liberation. For ordinary people, training in meditation, mindfulness, and ethical living ensures a more peaceful transition. By cultivating awareness in life, we prepare ourselves to face death not with fear, but with clarity, and perhaps, even with the power to choose a higher destiny. The role of meditation in breaking the cycle of rebirth. Meditation is not merely a practice for calming the mind, it is the key to breaking the endless cycle of rebirth. According to the Buddha, our continued existence in samsara is fueled by three fundamental forces: ignorance, craving, and ego clinging. Ignorance blinds us from seeing reality as it is, making us mistake the impermanent for the permanent. Craving binds us to the material world, compelling us to seek fleeting pleasures that never truly satisfy. Ego clinging traps us in the illusion of a separate, unchanging self, causing endless suffering as we struggle to defend and reinforce this false identity. Through meditation, we systematically dismantle these illusions, freeing the mind from the karmic chains that bind it to existence after existence. One of the most profound methods is vipassana, insight meditation, which trains the mind to observe thoughts, sensations, and emotions with pure awareness. When one truly sees the impermanence of all things, the rising and passing of each breath, each sensation, each mental state, the attachment to worldly concerns begins to loosen. The great Buddhist scholar Nagarjuna emphasized that suffering does not come from external events, but from our minds clinging to them. A person who masters vipassana can watch even pain and pleasure arise and fade without reacting, thereby dissolving the karmic imprints that would otherwise dictate future rebirths. Another transformative practice is metta, loving-kindness meditation, which cultivates boundless compassion toward all beings. Since hatred, resentment, and ill will generate negative karma that leads to lower rebirths, metta acts as an antidote, purifying the heart and creating conditions for liberation. The story of Angulimala, a ruthless murderer who was transformed by the Buddha's teachings, illustrates this power. After practicing loving-kindness and renouncing violence, Angulimala not only escaped the consequences of his past deeds but attained enlightenment, proving that karma is not fixed. Redemption is always possible through inner transformation. Perhaps the most revolutionary form of meditation is non-self contemplation, anatta meditation, which deconstructs the illusion of an enduring I. When meditating deeply on the nature of self, one discovers that what we call me is nothing more than a collection of ever-changing thoughts, perceptions, and sensations. This insight is not intellectual, it is a direct experience that shatters the ego's grip. Zen master Huanghua Shiyan once said, "If you wish to be free, know that there is no self to be freed." Many monks, upon realizing this truth, have immediately broken free from samsara. The legendary yogi Milarepa is a perfect example of how meditation can rewrite one's destiny. Born into suffering and consumed by vengeance, he once used black magic to destroy his enemies. Yet, through unwavering meditation and deep repentance, he purified his karma, attaining enlightenment in a single lifetime. His journey from sinner to saint proves that meditation is not just a passive practice but a radical force that can reshape reality itself. To meditate is to take control of one's fate. It is to refuse to be swept away by karmic winds and instead steer one's consciousness toward liberation. The Buddha's final words to his disciples were clear: "Be a light unto yourselves." He did not promise salvation from an external force, only the path of inner awakening. Through meditation, we do not escape life, we awaken to its true nature, breaking the chains of suffering once and for all. Imagine waking up each day with the unshakable awareness that your life is not controlled by fate but shaped by your own intentions and actions. No more feeling trapped in suffering, no more uncertainty about your purpose, only the profound realization that you hold the key to your destiny. Every thought you think, every word you speak, and every action you take is crafting the reality you will step into, not just in this life, but in the lives to come. Now is the time to take control of your spiritual journey. Begin by observing your thoughts and actions. Are they leading you toward wisdom and liberation, or deeper into suffering? Cultivate mindfulness, practice compassion, and make conscious choices that align with your highest self. Even the smallest shift in awareness today can alter the course of your future. Will you let past karma define you, or will you rise above it and walk the path to enlightenment? We are building a global community of seekers, those who choose wisdom over ignorance, compassion over selfishness, and freedom over attachment. Join us by liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Let's spread the transformative power of Zen Buddhism and create a world where more people awaken to their true nature. Your destiny is not written in stone. It is written by you. Choose wisely.